Hello, I'd like to talk to you about errors in the Bible, and the subject here is going to be post-resurrection appearances. Um, Rather than going through and giving a summary of each of the accounts of the post-resurrection appearances, that takes a little too much time, it seems. I'm just going to note where those accounts are and then note some additions, some variations, and some um, differences in accounts that don't seem like that they are reconcilable. Um, so the the I found in my understanding there are in the New Testament there are 5 accounts of the resurrection, post-resurrection appearances, and the first one is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and then in the Gospels at the end of Matthew, at the end of Mark, the last chapter of each of those, and the last chapter of Luke, and the last 2 chapters of John, and then finally the first chapter of the book of Acts has a post-resurrection account. Now, as far as the variations in the text, as many of us know, and it's well established, that the ending of Mark, that there's an account in Mark where it goes up to the point where the 2 Marys go out to the tomb, and they are told by a young man that Jesus is alive, and they were terrified, ran off, and didn't say anything to anybody. That's where the original account ends. It's not necessarily where the story, the book ends, but that's where the original ends. That's all we know of it. And then there's a longer and a shorter ending of the book of that account. And that longer account, it says that Mary told the others, but they did not believe her account. And Jesus came disguised, 2 of them who were walking. They went and found the rest, and they didn't believe their account either. And later Jesus appeared to the 11 themselves, and he chastised them for not believing the testimonies of the others who had saw him earlier. And then Jesus was taken up into heaven. Now all that is not part of the original. I think in that account also it talks about walking on serpents and some other strange stuff. Not walking, sorry, walking on fire and taking up serpents and things like that. Kind of a strange addition there. In Luke, we have as far as variations go in Luke, it says that whenever after the ladies came back and they told the disciples they didn't believe it, it says that Peter went out to the tomb and checked it out and then went home. Not all texts say that, but it's added in some. And also, at kind of right at the tail end of the resurrection account, some texts add that Jesus was carried up into heaven and they worshipped him. Now, it's unreasonable to think that a copyist would accidentally leave that off. So that appears to be an addition that somebody wanted to add to it. There doesn't seem to be a lot of any notable additions or changes to the account given in John. But in Acts, one thing to note is this is not a variation of the text. It's just to note that Luke wrote Acts. So Luke was the author of Acts. So you would think that the accounts of the resurrections, which we have in Luke and we have in Acts, would be the same. However, at the account in Luke, it says that Jesus was lifted up in a cloud out of their sight, and 2 men appeared, and the wording suggested they were angels who rather sarcastically asked them what they were looking at, and they told them that Jesus would return the same way. This isn't in the gospel account for the same writer, and it doesn't seem plausible that he would leave it out of one and put it in the other. Just a general notations about these accounts. In Matthew's account, it specifically says that these Mary and another Mary went out to the tomb. There was an earthquake, and an angel descended and rolled away the stone, and the guards appeared like dead men. Now, only in Matthew do we have an earthquake. Only in Matthew do we have the stone being rolled away once they get there. And only in Matthew do we have the guards. The timing of the visit to the tomb varies, but from before sunrise to after sunrise. Now this next point is it's a little bit difficult. It was kind of difficult for me to get my arms around it, but in one of the accounts it says, I think it's in Matthew, it says that the two ladies, they were told by the angel to go and tell his disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. Now, they went on their way, and it says, suddenly Jesus appeared to them. All right? And he said the same thing. He said, go tell my disciples to meet me in Galilee. All right? Now, in Luke, it says there were two walking on the road to Emmaus. And it says, as they walked along, they said that the two women had reported that angels had told them that Jesus was alive. Now, it doesn't make sense to say that angels told them, that they reported the angel told them that Jesus was alive when Jesus himself was there. So let's just, again, the angel said, go tell them that Jesus is resurrected, meet me in Galilee. Now, but immediately they ran into Jesus. So if they ran into Jesus and they went and reported it, they wouldn't say, hey guys, an angel told me that Jesus is alive. They said, no, they met Jesus. They would say, hey, I met Jesus. I saw him myself. But in Luke, it says that the two said that the women said that the angel said that Jesus was alive, and go meet him in Galilee and all. So that really doesn't make too much sense. Now, this next account is just some thoughts that I had on the resurrection, and this is not concrete. This is not necessarily a factual matter. It's just an observation. Okay, I'm just going to read this. I wrote this earlier, and I put some thought into it. I think it would come across better if I just tried to read it rather than just shooting from the hip. If Jesus still had his wounds after the resurrection and they were not healed, then one must assume that it was the same body. If this was the same body, then either the body was preserved somehow while he was dead, or it was restored when he was revived. If it was restored when he came back, then the damage due to the natural decay was undone. If this damage was undone, then it seems likely that the wounds could have also been healed, but the last two Gospels tell us that they were not. I recognize that this is not necessarily a conclusive point, but I might guess from this that the body must have been preserved somehow and then fixed just enough to support life again. Now, consider the account in Matthew where it tells us that right after Jesus died, there was an earthquake and tombs were opened and the bodies of many saints were raised. Oddly, it tells us that they did not come out of the tombs until after the resurrection of Jesus. Did they respectfully stay in their tomb until Jesus came out? Did they respectfully stay put so that Jesus would be the first out of the tomb? Were they hungry or thirsty in that interim period? Were they resurrected with their previous ailments as Jesus was? It is my guess that they had been dead long enough to significantly decay, and therefore their resurrection wouldn't have been of a preserved body such as I have guessed concerning Jesus. At any rate, it seems to me that a mass resurrection from the dead would have received more than a mere mention in only one of the gospel accounts. The resurrection appearances as accounted for in 1 Corinthians are followed by what appears to be a circular argument which relates the general resurrection of the dead and the resurrection of Jesus. The gist of this is that you cannot have one without the other. This dogmatic insistence that you cannot have either one without the other indicates that there is a similarity in the workings of each. And again, in this account, 1 Corinthians, in verse 42 of this same chapter, the writer tells us, what is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. In verse 44, it is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. Verse 45, The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Verse 46, the spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that the spiritual. Verse 50, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. So by all accounts given in chapter 15, verses 12 through 20, the resurrection of Jesus is similar to the general resurrection. This can be contrasted with the latter written gospel accounts, which depict a physical resurrection by emphasizing his still present wounds and the eating of food. Of course, these specific events may have been added for specific purposes, such as combating what was called Gnosticism, which taught that Jesus was only a spiritual being. For such reasons, this conundrum may be nothing more than a rabbit chase, with the truth being something that no one wants to hear. I've done my best just to note some of the differences. These can be dismissed. However, in a book that is supposed to be inerrant, I would invite you to go back to each of these points and review them and see if there is anything to them. This latter account that I give you on the resurrection, that's just something to think about. Was it a physical resurrection? Was it a spiritual resurrection? What were they trying to depict about Jesus in the gospel accounts? And again, in that dogmatic account, I think it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 also, verses 42 through 50, where it's saying that, whenever you're in the natural now and that's spiritual, and you'll be just like Jesus, and he was resurrection and he was spiritual, and just how does all that go together? It's kind of a strange thing. So there are some points here that are solid, and there's some points here like this about the resurrected body that are just something to think about. So if you would, just give it a chance and see what you think. Thanks.